So today, the purpose of today's session is to do a little bit on Rosh Hashanah. The truth is that this whole series, this term, was really using the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur Sukkot model, but today we're going to look at something specific with regard to Rosh Hashanah, and hopefully it will give a little bit of meaning and insight to the festival, and also a little bit of meaning to what we do in Shul. Sometimes we spend a bit of time in Shul on Rosh Hashanah, but we're not quite sure what's going on, or we don't understand the meaning of everything, and hopefully today will provide a little bit of insight. So I've called today the 3 sets of 10, and it's really a formula for life. It's a formula that represents the journey of life, very, very much integrated and connected with Rosh Hashanah. But let me first explain how we get to the 3 sets of 10, what the significance is of the number 10 and the 3 sets of 10 is. So on Rosh Hashanah, well, every time we pray Shabbat, weekday, Rosh Yontif, the main part of prayer is what we call the Amidah. And every single day of the year, the weekdays, the Amidah has 19 blessings. The first 3 standard blessings of praise, that's how the Amidah works. We praise God for 3 blessings. We end the Amidah with 3 blessings of thanks, and then we put stuff in the middle. So normally during a weekday, our prayers are structured that the middle blessings are requests. We ask God for all the things we need: health, sustenance, happiness, and so on and so forth. On a normal Yontif or Shabbat, the Amidah is 7 blessings. You got the first standard 3, the last standard 3, and then 1 blessing in the middle, a longer blessing, but 1 blessing in the middle, dealing with the theme of Shabbat or Yontif. The unique Amidah of the year is the Rosh Hashanah Musaf. After the Torah reading on Rosh Hashanah, you'll notice it's a very long Amidah. And the reason that it's long is because we have the first 3 standard blessings and the last 3, that's like every Amidah of the year. But then we've got 3 special blessings. 3 special blessings. And the 3 special blessings that we do on Rosh Hashanah, and only on Rosh Hashanah, relate to 3 special themes that are connected with Rosh Hashanah. And I'll put them for you on the handout over there. The one is Malchiyot, which is kingship. We talk about God being the king over the universe, the king over the Jewish people. We accept Him as our king. We re-coronate Him as our king. We ask Him to be the king over us. And that's the theme of that blessing, Malchiyot. The second is Zichronot, where we ask God to remember us. To remember the good things our forefathers did. To remember the binding of Isaac, which we talk about a lot on Rosh Hashanah, the self-sacrifice of Abraham. And just to remember all the generations, remember our covenant that we had from the giving of the Torah, and to remember us, so to speak, for a good year. And then the third blessing is Shofarot, which is the theme of Rosh Hashanah, dealing with the shofar, talking about the shofar. Now, each of these blessings are structured in a particular way. So besides the fact that there's 3 middle blessings, different to most festivals and Shabbat, there's another unique difference between how we do it on Rosh Hashanah to how we do it every other time of the year. And that is, in those blessings, there are 10 verses. In other words, in addition to praying, in addition to asking God to be our king, or to remember us, or to accept the blowing of the shofar that we blow, we quote in each of those blessings, we quote 10 verses from the Torah. And there are lots of commentaries of why we do that. It's a kind of, Rosh Hashanah is kind of the beginning of the year. We need to back ourselves up. So it's almost like symbolically we remind God that He kind of has to listen to us, because His own Torah says that He's the king, or His own Torah says that He's remembering us and accepting our shofar, etc., etc. So therefore we quote, before we ask, we actually quote, we back ourselves up. We bring a precedent, so to speak, or we quote from the Torah, and we talk about these verses that deal with these particular themes. And the way it's structured is that it's 10 verses in each of the blessings. So we have these 3 blessings: kingship, remembrance, and shofar. And in each blessing, we talk about 10 verses. We quote 10 verses. Now why 10? So 10 has many meanings. Of course, there were 10 commandments. Lots of things are connected with the number 10. But what I'm going to share with you today is, which is why I called it 3 sets of 10, is I thought which is based on the works of the Sfat Emet. I've alluded to it before, but I'm going to develop it a bit more today. The Sfat Emet was the one of the great Hasidic leaders of the dynasty of the Gur Hasidim, the Gera Hasidim, a great Rebbe before the war. And he says that the 3 sets of 10 have very big significance. That the idea of 3 tens is this. He says because at the beginning of creation, we find 3 sets of 10. What are the 3 sets of 10? The 3 sets of 10 are as follows. He said when God created the world, we read in Genesis, and the Talmud tells us, that there were 10 utterances with which God created the world. So God created the universe with 10 sayings. Let there be light, let there be trees, let there be plants, let there be animals, and so on. There's 10 times Vayomer and Bereshit, there's 10 utterances with which God created the world. That's the first set of 10. The second is the 10 plagues. When the Jews were in Egypt and they left Egypt, we know that God brought upon the Egyptians 10 plagues, dismantling the infrastructure of the Egyptian regime, preparing the Jews for the Exodus, and there were 10 plagues that allowed the Jews afterwards to experience Exodus. And then following the Exodus from Egypt, the Jews traveled to Mount Sinai, and it was at Mount Sinai that we had the ultimate Jewish historic event, which was the giving of the Torah, the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, where that was the historic moment where we actually became God's nation, so to speak. Finally, the full marriage, the full relationship between us and God happened at Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai, God gave us the 10 commandments. And that encapsulated the essence of what the Torah is. So it's three sets of 10. The 10 utterances with which God created the world, the 10 plagues, and the 10 commandments. Now the truth is, that's very nice, but what does that mean? I mean, it's, you can find connections between numbers, so there were 10 this, there were 10 that. But what's the connection between these 3 sets of 10, and what's the significance that God created the world with 10 utterances, and then there was 10 plagues, and then there was 10 commandments? Why the connection? Where's the theme? Where's the pattern? And what's connecting it? And what does it have to do, going back to our 3 special blessings of Rosh Hashanah, the kingship, the remembrance, and the shofar? We clear? Yep. So let's go back to the very essence of Rosh Hashanah. The Talmud tells us that Rosh Hashanah has many themes, right? As does Yom Kippur and all the other festivals. But says the Talmud that when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, mitzvat hayom b'shofar, the essence of the day, in other words, what brings out the essence of Rosh Hashanah, is the mitzvah of listening to the sounds of the shofar. That's the essence of Rosh Hashanah. Now, what's the mitzvah of hearing the shofar? The truth is that we blow a lot of sounds today in shul, but it goes back to one essential mitzvah. And that is in the Torah, it says that we've got to blow the shofar. And what the Torah tells us is as follows. The original mitzvah, we've expanded it today, but the original mitzvah of listening to the shofar is that the Torah instructs us that we've got to repeat 3 times the following formula. The formula that the Torah gives us is that we've got to blow a sound called a tkiyah. A tkiyah is that long sound, that long smooth sound. Followed by what the Torah refers to as a truah, which is a broken up sound, followed by another tkiyah, which is a long sound. All right? Now just for general knowledge, there's a whole discussion in the Talmud because the Torah actually talks about tkiyah, teruah, and tkiyah. We're not sure what a truah is. Is it a lot of short sounds like a tu 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 tu, or is it 3 longish broken sounds like tu tu tu, right? Or the combination of both, which explains why we blow so many different combinations on Rosh Hashanah to cover all of them. It's a whole discussion about, because the truah resembles crying, and what type of the different ways of crying. Sometimes people sob out of breath, and that's short sound. Some people kvetch more, that's sort of longish sounds. Sometimes they first kvetch and then they sob, right? So different combinations. But essentially it's all based on the one formula. This is the point I want to bring out. It's all based on one formula. The formula is that you blow a long sound first, followed by broken up sounds, whatever combination that is, followed by another long sound. That's the formula, and that's repeated 3 times as far as the Torah. And we as I say, we blow a lot more than that, but that's the original formula. Now what's the idea? behind that. Why did the Torah tell us to do that? So the Sfat Emet explains the following. And he says the two sounds of the shofar, which is on the one hand the long smooth sound, and on the other hand the broken up sound, represent two experiences in life. Right? The long smooth sound, the tkiya, right? That's a symbol of purity, innocence, smoothness. Right? Sometimes we experience that in life where things just go according to plan. We have clarity, innocence, smoothness, clockwork, everything fits into place, happiness, things are going along. But as we know, life isn't always like that. Right? Sometimes life is more like a trua. And a trua means a broken up sounds, where things are broken up. There's a lack of clarity. There's darkness, there's confusion. There's ups and downs, there's questions, there's challenges, sometimes it's adversity, sometimes it's tragedy even. Right? And that's what the trua represents. It's not a smooth experience. It's a challenging experience. It's a roller coaster type experience. And what he explains is as follows. That when a person is born, as we know, when a baby is born, life begins with a tkiya. Maybe that cry the baby gives maybe represents a tkiya, I don't know. But life begins with a tkiya. Babies are pure, babies are innocent, they're wonderful, they're of course cute. I never understood why, but yeah, they are apparently. It's one, right? It's just absolute, they've got no worry, no challenge. A baby is born, it's a soul of absolute pristineness and purity. And that's how life begins. That's the journey of life begins. But it doesn't remain that way for very long, as we know. And somewhere along the journey of life, the trua sets in. So life begins as a tkiya, and then somewhere along the line, there's a trua. There's questions, there's challenges, there's lack of clarity, lack of direction, lack of moral clarity, external challenges from without, challenges from within. We've all born with personalities that have a little bit of rough patches to them. We've got our own inner challenges we have to deal with. So there's a lot of trua and shvarim, there's a lot of broken up sounds that come with the journey of life. But says the Sfat Emet, the purpose of life, of course, the mission that we have, is to blow another tkiya, is to create smoothness and purity that emerges from the trua. In other words, the purpose of the challenge is to turn it into opportunity. The power within the adversity is to turn it into clarity, into purity. And that's the second tkiya. So life begins with a tkiya. It very often, more often than not, somewhere along the line, on some level, evolves into a trua. But the purpose is then to transform and to discover a tkiya from within the trua. To discover clarity and purpose and meaning coming from the darkness and the challenge and the lack of clarity. Right. And of course what he explains is that the second tkiya is a lot deeper than the first, and that's the purpose of it all. As King Solomon says, King Solomon, the wisest of all men, of course, said that he saw the advantage of wisdom from foolishness. Well, the normal translation is that King Solomon says, I saw the great advantage of wisdom over foolishness, like darkness over, like light over darkness. Right? That's what King Solomon says. But truth is, if you look at the Hebrew words, it's not quite an accurate translation. The way he says when he talks about light coming from darkness or light from darkness, he doesn't say, King Solomon doesn't say, I saw the advantage of light over darkness. That's not what he says. He says, Yitron ha'or min ha'choshech. I saw the advantage of light min, from darkness. Now it could be translated as to mean contextually over darkness, but the commentary explains that's not what he means. King Solomon is saying is I saw the advantage, the depth, the greatness of light that comes min. In Hebrew, min means from, comes from the darkness. That when you have light to begin with, it's a light taken for granted, it's a limited light. But when you take light that is being created by transformation from darkness, when you take darkness and you turn it into light, That's a brighter light and a deeper light and a greater light. And that's represented by the second tkiyah. So you have the first tkiyah which is innocence and purity and clarity, but that's a limited clarity. Because when a person experiences the first tkiyah, there's no telling, there's no way to tell how deep and how strong that person is in the face of a truah. You follow, when a person is only a tkiyah person, what that really means is a tkiyah person as long as there's no truah. But sometimes there's a truah, then the whole thing falls apart. But when a person experiences a truah, and then is able to work that through, find the silver lining, find the opportunity, find the depth, find the strength that could be taken from the truah, and creating another tkiyah, that tkiyah is infinitely greater. That tkiyah represents the person who's really strong, who's really deep, who can even transform the negative into the positive. There's in the Talmud, there's an interesting halachic concept where the Talmud talks about, it's laws of borrowing and lending and business transaction and so on. And the Talmud talks about the concept of a shtar. A shtar means a document. Now the way it works is, just to understand halachically, if I borrow money from someone or whatever, I enter into a business transaction and we create a document, halachically that document needs to be signed by two witnesses. Now, if someone owes me money and I front up in a court, in a Beit Din, and I challenge a person, I say, look, you owe me money. So he says, where's the proof? And I produce a document that is signed by two witnesses. That's a kosher document, provided it looks all okay. And I have the right then to extract the money from that other person. But what happens, says the Talmud, if that document is challenged, the guy says, okay, it's forged. Prove to me that the document is authentic. So there's a process, they call in the Talmud kiyum hashtar, which means there's a process to authenticate the document, right? So it's called in the Talmud the shtar sheyatsa alav irur. It's a document that was challenged. And then, after the document was challenged, it was then authenticated and validated again, right? So the Talmud says, halachically, a document that has been challenged and then validated is now a rock solid document that could never be undermined. It's much stronger than the first one. And that doesn't mean to say the first one wasn't good. The first one was powerful. You could claim money with the first one as well. But the first one is as good as long as it's not challenged. You don't know how good it will be when it's challenged. But a document, a shtar that's being challenged and then validated is a much stronger document. It's the same sort of idea. You have a tkiyah, you have a smooth experience of life, which is wonderful, but it only represents the strength of the person in a limited way as long as things remain wonderful. But when we experience the truah, on whatever level, it could be a challenge, it could be a challenge from within, it could be an internal personality issue, it could be a failing that we've gone through, that we have to work through, whatever the challenge is. And we work through that tkiyah and create another, we work through the truah and we create another tkiyah. That second tkiyah is infinitely greater and deeper than the first. If you look at I was actually going to bring one today, but I forgot if you look at the shofar, right? The shofar is shaped in a way where you blow through a very, very narrow mouthpiece, but the sound comes out of a very wide opening, right? That's how the shofar works. Small at the beginning, but wide at the end. And one of the reasons for that is, besides that it grows that way, but it grows away for a reason, right? So one of the reasons for that is actually it's represented in one of the verses that we say before we blow the shofar in the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. And we say, Min ha-meitzar karatika, King David said, I call to you, God, from narrowness, from constrictiveness, anani, but you answer me broadly. In other words, the same sort of idea that sometimes when you work through a narrowness of life, when you work through an experience that seems challenging, that's limiting us, that's challenging us, and you work through and you blow the shofar through that, the voice that comes out at the end is much wider. It's broadness, it's unlimited, it's infinite. That's the idea. So essentially, that actually becomes the theme of Rosh Hashanah. That idea is the theme of Rosh Hashanah. Why? Rosh Hashanah is the new year. Rosh Hashanah is that stage in the change process that we talked about over the last few weeks, which is the commitment, coming after the reflection of the month of Elul. But Rosh Hashanah, as the commentaries explain, is really about transformation. It's a new beginning. But when we talk about a new beginning in Rosh Hashanah, it's not about negating the past, right? It's not like, okay, let me forget anything that happened last year and let's just start afresh. It's not about that. It is about that on one level. In other words, of course, every year that begins, we pray and we want a freshness for ourselves, a freshness for our blessings, a freshness for our family, a new start, a new beginning. But part of that new beginning also comes from learning from the past year. It also comes from the ability, and that's the idea of tshuva, of repentance, of return. That the whole theme of these days is the ability to take anything negative that was in the past and not just to discard it, but to learn from it and to use it to become even a stronger person and transform it to something positive. It's about taking the trua and turning it into another tkiyah. Right? Now I've mentioned this before, but that also explains the concept of honey, right? We all know from when we were in kindergarten that on Rosh Hashanah we dip the apple into honey. What's the idea? Why honey? And incidentally, not all communities use honey. I don't know if you know this. So Ashkenazim use honey. Some communities of Sephardic communities actually use other things. I think some use sugar even, or someone told me yesterday a sort of an apple jam of some sort. Dates, yeah, dates is a food that people eat on Rosh Hashanah, of course. But in Ashkenazi communities, the custom is very prevalent to use honey. So we dip apple into honey, we dip the challah into honey. In fact, I'm not sure if you're aware, but some people have the custom to dip a challah on Shabbat. We dip challah into salt, but on Rosh Hashanah we dip challah into honey all the way till the end of Sukkot, right? Because it's a whole month process, not just Rosh Hashanah. It's Rosh Hashanah, Erev Yom Kippur, on the day after Yom Kippur, Sukkot. It's all part of the new flow of blessing that is happening, right? We kind of, the Rosh Hashanah blessing begins on Rosh Hashanah and ends with Simchat Torah. That's how it works. It's a whole month journey, right? Why honey? Now, why do I say why honey? What's wrong with honey? Honey's sweet, right? But there's a problem with honey. See, an apple, a sweet apple that is, that we normally use, one should use a sweet apple. An apple has natural sweetness to it. An apple grows sweet. That's how it works. Honey actually is very sweet, but honey comes from an animal that's not. Honey comes from an animal that stings. Right? Not only it comes from an animal that stings, but I think I've mentioned this before, but honey is a very interesting discussion in the Talmud about honey. Because honey comes from a non-kosher creature. And there's a whole discussion in the Talmud of how honey is kosher to begin with. Because we know that the normal rule in the laws of kashrut is that something that comes from a non-kosher animal is not kosher. So an egg that comes from a non-kosher animal is not a kosher egg. Milk that comes from a non-kosher animal is not, pig's milk is treif, is not kosher. Right? Camel milk is not kosher. I saw recently there's a big industry now happening with camel milk. Right? But it's not kosher because the camel is also not kosher, therefore the milk is not kosher. So honey is the only exception. Honey is an interesting thing that it's something that comes from a non-kosher creature and yet it's kosher. Now there's a whole discussion in the Talmud how that works, because it's got to do, and I don't understand these things, it's not my field, but it's got to do with how the honey is processed. It's not actually fully absorbed in the bee. The bee is sort of just more like a conduit, whatever the case is. But the bottom line is that honey comes from a bee which isn't kosher, and it comes from an animal that stings. And that's exactly why we use honey on Rosh Hashanah. Because the concept of Rosh Hashanah, the sweetness that we ask God for on Rosh Hashanah, is not just a sweetness that is naturally sweet. We ask Him for a sweetness that will take anything that might be negative, anything that is potentially negative, or any inner struggle that we might have, and the ability to turn it into complete sweetness. The sweetness that we ask for in Rosh Hashanah is a sweetness of transformation. It's a sweetness which is similar to the tkiyah which comes after the trua, not the tkiyah that comes before the trua. It's a tkiyah that emerges from adversity, from darkness. We all have aspects of trua within our lives. We pray not to have too much, but we all have some aspects of it. We all have some level of failure or weakness in the past year. We all have some level of challenge in the last year, some more, some less. But what we ask God when it comes to Rosh Hashanah is, give us a sweet year, which means not just sweet going forward, but give us the ability to transform anything that is negative into a new emergence of tkiyah, a new purity, a deeper smoothness. So let's just develop this a little bit. Actually, before we do that, just interesting, one of the great Hasidic commentaries, the Bnei Yissaschar, points out an interesting thing. The word for honey, of course, in Hebrew is dvash. So one of the reasons that we use the honey in Rosh Hashanah, he says, besides this idea I've just shared with you, is that we know in Hebrew every word has a numerical value, a gematria, right? So the gematria of dvash, the gematria of honey, the Hebrew word for honey, which is dvash, is Av Harachamim, merciful Father. I've worked it out, it's correct, it's accurate. Av Harachamim, merciful Father. Which in itself is a beautiful idea because we refer to God in Rosh Hashanah as being the merciful Father. We ask Him for mercy, we ask Him for compassion. Right? But it goes a step deeper than that, in line with this discussion that we're having. Because Kabbalistically, what is the concept of Rachamim, the concept of compassion? You know, we've talked about it hundreds of times, the makeup of the soul, or the 10 powers with which God created the world. The 3 intellectual and the 7 emotional, right? But the 3 primary forces are Chesed on the right, Gvura on the left, and Tiferet in the middle. Beauty. The concept of Rachamim, the concept of compassion, is very often compared to the idea of Tiferet, of beauty. Why? What is the definition of compassion? If, let's say, a parent has compassion on their child, what is the idea of compassion? Compassion, you don't need to have on someone that's doing everything right. Right? You don't pity someone that is okay. You don't need to have pity. So the way it works is in these 3 forces is when we ask God for Rachamim on Rosh Hashanah, the idea of Rachamim is that there should be compassion even when there's negativity. And that's why it's a combination between Chesed and Gvura. I'm just saying this briefly because I wanted to just highlight it as we're talking about Dvash. But the idea of Chesed is where everything is going smoothly. Same sort of idea. Gvura represents a sort of more of a harshness, of a severity where sometimes it appears on the surface to be challenging and negative. Rachamim combines the two. Mercy combines the two. It's the idea of using the power of Chesed to transform the concealment and the challenge of Gvura and creating compassion, which is the idea of Gevurah, which is the idea of Tiferet, the idea of harmony and beauty. And that's why the Dvash fits in very nicely with this idea, because Dvash is about transformation. And that's why it's Av HaRachamim, the merciful Father, asking for the concept of Rachamim, of compassion, which is the ability, the power to turn negativity into something positive. Now let's just develop this a little bit. We're coming to the close of the month of Elul, right? So that this month, we've talked about this before, is a month of reflection. It's a month where we look back. And sometimes we look back at a year and it's a year where it has been challenging. There's been different challenges. People could have had challenges in their relationships. They've had a fallout with someone, having relationship issues, right? Things seem to be going negatively. Personal growth issues, spiritual growth issues, external challenges, and so on. So sometimes we look back at the year and there's a very big trua. You know, the trua is very big. The tkiyah has become a little bit small and the trua has become very big. And obviously one of the natural tendencies of the human being is to give up. Right? The human being has the ability to work through a trua, but it's not always easy. Why? Because sometimes when we look at the trua, especially if it's significant, we see the trua. We see what it looks like on the outside. We see the challenge. And a challenge sometimes seems insurmountable. So let me share with you an incredible little story, which of course is in the extreme, and it's maybe levels that we're not up to, but you know, we often say this, when you bring stories in the extreme, at least we can then learn from them, draw some inspiration and apply them to ourselves. So it's a post-Holocaust story, and it's actually got to do with the same, with the Ger Rebbe that I was talking about, the Sfat Emet. It's got to do with his son, who became the next Ger Rebbe. And after the war, a Chassid, one of his followers, came to him. The Ger Rebbe's son, the Sfat Emet's son, was called the Imre Emet, and he actually emigrated to Israel in the middle of the war. It was a whole miracle, but lost tons of his family. and his Hasidim. The Gerach Hasidim were the heart of Polish Hasidim, and they were one of the most hit in the Holocaust. Being Poland was, of course, one of the most hit places. And a Chassid came to him in total despair, and said, "I just can't. There's no way I can go on." As is understandable. And of course, there were those that did give up, and they cannot ever be judged because we'll never know even a fraction of what they went through. But this Chassid came to the Rebbe and says, "You need to help me. I don't want to give up, but I don't see any other way. I just can't work through this. This challenge has been too difficult." In other words, his trua was just so unbelievable that impossible, and he started to cry. As he started to cry, the Ger Rebbe also started to cry out of feeling for his own disciple. And for a few minutes, the story goes that the Ger Rebbe took his hand and they just cried together. When he finished, when they sort of both calmed down, the Ger Rebbe said, "Let me now share with you an insight." And the insight goes like this. It's something we read in the weekly parsha a few weeks ago. And he said the following. He said, when God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, He gave Moses the Luchot, the 10 commandments of stone. Right? Moses went up for 40 days in the desert, 40 days in the mountain, and he came down with, 40 days later, after Shavuot, he came down with what we know it to be today as the first set of Luchot. They were divinely inscribed. They were a miraculous piece of stone that had come from Shamayim, come from heaven. They weren't mined down here. The stone was divinely designed. The engraving, the letters was divinely inscribed. And Moses comes down the mountain with these 10 commandments, an object of complete holiness. And he comes down to a horror story. He comes down on the 17th of Tammuz to witness the Jews sinking to the lowest level that could possibly have happened after the giving of the Torah. He sees them serving an idol, serving the golden calf. Idolatry, one of the 3 cardinal sins. Right? And he comes close to the camp and he sees and he witnesses this. And as the Medrash says, the stones become incredibly heavy and he smashes the Luchot, he smashes the 10 commandments. He goes then up for another set of 40 days to try and get God to forgive the Jewish people, unsuccessfully. The Jews tried to do tshuva, they tried to reconnect, they tried to see the mistaken ways, and they tried to sort of elevate themselves. It doesn't work. Moses comes down at the end of the month of Av and goes back up for a 3rd time at the beginning of Elul, which is why Elul has since then become a special time. He goes up for a 2nd set of 40 days and comes down on Yom Kippur. Right? That was the history of it, and that's why Yom Kippur became the day it is. But Moses comes down the day of Yom Kippur with a 2nd set of tablets. But this time the stones are different. This time God had told Moses to carve out the stone himself. He had to carve it out himself down here, take it up with him. God inscribed it. He came back with a 2nd set of tablets, and it was the day of Yom Kippur, and that day God forgave the Jewish people. And ever since then Yom Kippur became a day of forgiveness. Okay. 40 years later, as the Jews are about to go into Israel, Moses, 37 days before he passes on, he gives them a prep talk. Right? Because then obviously they landed up in the desert for 40 years because of the story of the spies. And as they're about to go, it's the parshas we're reading now in the Chumash, towards the end of the Chumash. Moses gives them a prep talk and he says to them, you're going into Israel, it's going to be a different type of experience, you're leaving the spirituality of the desert, you're going to have to farm, you're going to have to reconnect, that's the whole thing. And he gives them inspiration, he gives them a recap of history for the last 40 years, he repeats some of the mitzvot. It's a very fascinating book, and that's the book of Deuteronomy. Dvarim. One of the things is Moshe Rabbeinu is he recounts the story of when they served the golden calf and when he came down and he broke the luchot, he broke the tablets. And the Ger Rebbe says to his disciple, he says, I want you to look at something. If you look at the wording, how Moshe Rabbeinu recounts the story, he says the following. He says, I came down the mountain and I saw you guys failing. I saw you guys serving the golden calf. And he says, I grasped the 2 tablets and threw them down from my 2 hands. Right? And then he says, Va'ashabrem le'einechem. I broke them before your eyes. I broke them before your eyes. So the Gerei Rebbe said to his disciple, he says, we know that every word in the Chumash is exact. Everything is exact. So why did Moshe Rabbeinu have to say, I broke them before your eyes? Contextually, that's obvious. He says, I came down the mountain, I was standing in front of you, I witnessed you serving the golden calf, I took the luchot, I took the 2 tablets, and I smashed them. Now obviously, he smashed them in front of them. What does he mean to say, why is he emphasizing, I smashed them before your eyes? So only the Gerei Rebbe could say this, who had himself gone through so much. Right? One has to be careful who one says this kind of thing to and what we've gone through. But the Gerei Rebbe who went through the same as the disciple had the license to say this to his disciple, and he said the following. He said, because Moshe Rabbeinu was telling them that when there's challenge, when there's the breaking of the luchot, when I broke the tablets, which was God's handy piece of work, this was we fast on the 17th of Tammuz. One of the reasons for the fast is because it was the day Moses broke the luchot. I mean, it's an incredible thing to break the 10 commandments that God had himself carved out. But Moshe Rabbeinu said that when I broke it, which was a symbol of the ultimate trua, right? The ultimate broken sound, it was only la'einechem. The breaking was only superficial, was only to your eyes. Because behind the breaking was already the seeds of a whole new opportunity that was going to emerge from that destruction. Yes, what you saw was destruction, but that's only what you saw. Because la'einechem, before your eyes, it was a breaking of the luchot, before your eyes. But behind that breaking, behind the destruction, there were seeds of an incredible growth that was going to emerge and be greater than before. And in fact, the Talmud tells us an amazing thing. That the first set of luchot were holier, were divine, they were divinely carved. And yet they didn't last. And in fact, not only did it last, but the Torah that was given, the Torah knowledge that was given together with the first tablets was a limited amount of knowledge. The infinity of the Torah that we have today, the depth of Jewish learning that we have today, and the eternity of the second luchot only came with the second one. It only came because the Jews worked through the challenge. They worked through their failure. They reconnected. They were able to work through the whole thing and reconnect to God in a proper way. And what they got was the second luchot, which turned out to be much stronger and much more eternal than the first ones. Even though the first ones were holier, but the second ones were deeper. And that's why I said, Va'ashabrem la'einechem, it is only before your eyes that they broke. In truth, they were already the seeds for something much greater. So that's an extreme explanation of this. But going back to Rosh Hashanah, it's the same idea. Same idea is sometimes we look at the last year and we sometimes see maybe there were things that symbolize the trua. We did fail. We thought we'd be better in our relationships, we weren't. We thought we'd be better controlling our temper, didn't always work out. We thought with this, we thought with that. We had some external challenges, we had internal challenges. There were some truas. But those challenges, they were challenges, but they're only la'einechem, they're superficial, ultimately. Because behind those challenges lie incredible opportunities for growth, and therefore we should never give up. And therefore when we come to the new year, part of our commitment has to be not to say, well, I can't change. No. Part of our commitment has to be to look back and identify some of those truths, some of those brokennesses, and say, I can use them for opportunity. I can use them to create even a greater tkiyah. I can take the bee sting and turn it into sweetness. I can transform, and when we have that commitment to transform just a little bit, God does the same. That's what we're told, and He transforms anything negative and hopefully gives us a completely sweet year. And as we've said so many times, our commitment doesn't have to be huge. It has to be each one in their own journey, in their own level. There's a beautiful law when it comes to blowing the shofar. You know, you've all heard the shofar, presumably, and you'll know that it's not, at least the way us rabbis blow it, it's not the most musical sounding instrument, right? But it doesn't have to be. Thank God. The Mishnah says, there's a law in the Mishnah, there's 2 laws when it comes to the shofar, beautiful laws. And it says like this, that kol hakolot ksherim, there's a mitzvah to blow the shofar in Rosh Hashanah, but any sound, you have to get a sound out of the horn, right? But any sound, it doesn't matter how it sounds. You've got to blow them halachically correctly, in other words, the right length and all that, but whatever sound it sounds like, if it's high-pitched, it's low, it's musical, it sounds terrible, it's fine. A sound of the shofar is a sound of the shofar. But yet there's also a very interesting law that comes with it. All the voices that you put out of the shofar are okay, but it says that if, and there's a historic background to what, I mean this law sounds bizarre, but it's, because we wouldn't do it today, but there's a historical background of when people used to have to hide and weren't able to blow the shofar in public and so on during the Roman regime. But it says if someone blows the shofar in a big barrel, in a big cistern, which is place, or a pit, these are places that people used to hide sometimes in order to do these, to go through these religious practices because they weren't able to do it in public. So the Mishnah says you have to be very careful. Why? Because if you blow the shofar, let's say, in a big pit or a big cistern, and there's someone standing outside and he hears it, he hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah. Why not? Because it's possible that he hasn't heard the voice of the shofar. He's only heard an echo. Right? Now, what's the depth behind that? That's a halakhic thing. What's the depth behind it? Depth behind it is, what's an echo? We know the definition of an echo is something that doesn't become absorbed in the surface where it hits. Why do we have an echo? Because it rebounds. Right? So now let's put these two laws together. The Mishnah says any voice you produce in the shofar is good, but it can't be an echo. In other words, any little change that we make on Rosh Hashanah is fantastic. It doesn't have to be great. It doesn't have to be amazing. It has to be one step forward. It has to be one little effort to turn our own little trua into another tkiyah. Any voice is good. But it's got to be real. It's got to be internalized. It's got to be absorbed. It can't be superficial. It doesn't have to be sophisticated, but it can't be just something I decide to do on the day before Rosh Hashanah and then forget about it after Rosh Hashanah. It's got to be something that I do, as we've spoken about the last few weeks, small but real, specific but deep. So kolak kolot ksherim, any voice is good. Whatever you produce, any change you make, any effort that we make to turn something that we might have experienced as a trua and to see the depth in it and to emerge a stronger person and to improve just a little bit is fantastic, as long as it's not an echo, as long as we absorb it and it becomes part of who we are. So now let's go back to the 3 tens and understand them. So it says the Sfat Emet that the same thing happened when, just like the journey of life is this way, that's how the world was created. And that's the model where we take it from. When God created the world, He created the world with 10 utterances, corresponding of course to the 10 powers of creation. But the creation of the world was like the first tkiyah. When God created the world, it was perfect before we messed it up. It was pure world, it was a tkiyah world. But after the tkiyah, there was idolatry, there was failing, there was conflict, there was the flood, there was all kinds of things, and ultimately landed up in the Jews having to go down to exile, to be exiled in Egypt for 210 years. The challenges, which had to then be worked through and be dismantled, and that was all represented by the 10 plagues. So the 10 plagues is like the end of and the symbol of the trua that comes after the tkiyah. But following the 10 plagues, he says, we left Egypt and God gave us the 10 commandments. Because the principles and the values of the 10 commandments, the Torah, is our moral tool, it's our moral code that we use to transform the 10 plagues, the trua, into the second tkiyah. And that's how creation works. And that's why in Rosh Hashanah we do 3 sets of 10. And then he says that the 3 sets of 10 also then fit into the theme of the 3 blessings. Going back to the beginning, remember we said the 3 blessings, the one refers to God being the king, the second is remembrance, and the third deals with the shofar. And it says same idea. God being the king, we know when God created the world, it says He was the king over the universe, and when Adam was created, in fact the Medrash says, he right away recognized God's sovereignty. There was clarity, it was clear, the world was a beautiful place, and God was the king, He was the creator, recognized by Adam. But then the trua sets in. And the trua, he says, is very similar to the theme of the second blessing. The theme of the second blessing is zichronot, to remember. What does remembrance mean? When do you have to remember something? When there's lack of clarity. You don't have to remember where the door of the room is if you can see it. Right? Remembering something is when something is distant, it's confused, it's lack of clarity, it's dark. And that's why the second blessing is called the zichronot, the blessing of remembrance, because it represents the trua. And then finally we have the third blessing, which is the essence of Rosh Hashanah, which deals with the theme of the shofar, because the shofar is that yearning, it's that reconnection, it's that process where we work through that trua and turn it into a greater tkiyah. So that's just an insight a little bit, and I hope that was a little bit helpful, but it's insight to approach Rosh Hashanah. That as we approach Rosh Hashanah, what we do is it's a two-way street. We trust, of course, God will give us all the sweetness and all the blessings that He's going to give us. But we need to do a little bit of our part as well. And our part is just to take one step forward, to take something that's more like a true in our life and see the opportunity and change and make one step forward, as we've been talking about the last few weeks, to create and transform it into a tkiyah. And when we do that, culminating and represented by the blowing of the shofar, of course, God does the same, and He will definitely bless us. So with that, I want to, of course, wish everyone Shana Tova, a good and sweet, a completely sweet and happy year. It should be a year of the ultimate tkiyah, ultimate smoothness and happiness and success for us and for the whole of Klal Yisrael. Shana Tova.